The silence of the grand rotunda was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath before the scream of a dying god. It was a suffocating, heavy stillness that pressed against the chest plates of the High Synod, a weight born of inevitable annihilation. The holographic projection in the center of the obsidian chamber, usually a vibrant tapestry of star systems and trade routes, was now a hemorrhaging wound of crimson light. Each blinking red marker represented a world lost, a fleet incinerated, a civilization silenced by the encroaching shadow of the Chthon ascendancy. The Chthon did not negotiate. They did not pause for breath. They were a biological tide, a hive mind of chitin and hunger that had swept through the outer rim in a single orbital cycle and was now tearing through the core systems with the indifference of a storm erasing a sandcastle. High Counselor Valcoro rested his three-fingered hands upon the cool surface of the obsidian table, his breathing shallow. He was old, ancient by the standards of the Athari people, his scales dulled to a matte gray, his eyes clouded with the wisdom of centuries. Yet in all his years, in all the cycles of history recorded in the crystalline archives of Athari Prime, he had never felt such profound helplessness. The air in the chamber smelled of ozone and terror, a pheromonal cocktail released by the dozens of species gathered there. The amphibious Gurlan, the crystalline Lithos, the ethereal Aaron. They were the galactic concordat, the pinnacle of civilization, the masters of energy manipulation and warp travel. And they were dying. The Chthon vanguard has breached the Helios line, General Thrax of the Gurlan announced, his voice a wet rasp that echoed mournfully off the high-vaulted ceiling. The fourth fleet has ceased transmitting. The fifth is scattered. There is nothing standing between the enemy and Athari Prime but the planetary shields and a handful of orbital defense platforms. A murmur of despair rippled through the gathered counselors. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. They had debated for weeks. They had argued over resource allocation, over retreat strategies, over the morality of sacrificing outer colonies to save the core. Now there was nothing left to debate. The end was not coming, it was here. It was waiting in the vacuum above their heads, charging its plasma lances. "We must initiate the Exodus Protocol," Counselor Xylia of the Aaron said, her voice trembling like a plucked string. She was luminous, her form shifting with her emotions, and currently she was dim, flickering with the gray of hopelessness. "We can scatter the seed ships. Perhaps some will survive in the dark space between galaxies. Perhaps the memory of us will not be entirely erased." Valcoro closed his eyes. The Exodus Protocol was an admission of total defeat. It was the act of a civilization committing suicide in the hopes that a few cells might survive the corpse. "And go where, Xylia?" he asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "The Chthon are faster than our seed ships. They track thermal wakes across parsecs. We would simply be feeding them our children in slow motion." "Then what?" Thrax slammed a fist onto the table, cracking the holographic projection. "Do we sit here and wait for the bombardment? Do we compose poetry while the atmosphere burns? We have exhausted every ally. We have drained every battery. There is no one left to call." Valcoro opened his eyes and looked at the center of the table, past the red slaughter of the map, to a small, unassuming data crystal that sat disconnected from the main network. It was an artifact, a relic found in the ruins of a dead world on the very edge of the spiral arm, a world that had been scorched black thousands of cycles ago. The artifact was simple, crude by their standards, encased in a shell of dense, primitive alloy. It was not a weapon. It was a transmitter. And attached to it was a warning, etched in a language that the universal translators had struggled to parse for decades before finding a root dialect in the oldest, most forbidden archives. "There is one option remaining," Valcoro said softly. The room fell silent. Even General Thrax paused, his gills flaring. "What option? The mercenaries of the Zul sector have already fled. The artificial intelligence collective has walled itself off." "Not a mercenary," Valcoro said. He reached out and picked up the heavy, dark object. It felt cold, colder than the room, as if it absorbed the heat around it. "And not a machine." He placed the object into the interface slot of the central console. The holographic map flickered, the red of the invasion temporarily replaced by a rotating symbol, a geometric shape consisting of a circle and a spear, simple, brutal, archaic. "The myth," Xylia whispered, her light dimming further in genuine fear. "You cannot be serious, High Counselor. They are a fable, a nursery rhyme." He told to frighten hatchlings into obedience. "Be silent, or the Terrans will hear you. They do not exist." "The archives say otherwise," Valcoro countered, his voice gaining strength. The archives speak of a species that did not evolve with the grace of the Concordat. We were lifted up by the precursors, taught the ways of the warp and the harmony. But this species, they crawled out of the mud of a high-gravity death world. They split the atom before they cured their own plagues. They conquered their own moon before they stopped killing each other over patchworks of soil. Savages, a Lithos counselor chimed in, their crystalline body vibrating with disdain. Barbaric, kinetic-wielding primitives. If they ever existed, they destroyed themselves eons ago. That is the nature of such violent biologicals. Perhaps, Valcoro admitted, or perhaps they did not destroy themselves. Perhaps they realized that a galaxy filled with beautiful, fragile things was not a place for them, and so they withdrew. The legends say they went into the deep dark, the spaces where the stars do not shine, to sleep until the noise of the galaxy became loud enough to wake them. This is madness, Thrax spat. We are facing extinction and you are invoking ghosts. That device is a paperweight, Valcoro. It is a beacon, Valcoro said, his finger hovering over the activation rune. The text translated from the ruin was specific. It did not promise salvation. It did not promise peace. It promised an end. An end to what? Xylia asked. To the screaming, Valcoro replied. Before anyone could stop him, before the logic of the high civilization could override the desperate superstition of a dying old man, Valcoro pressed the rune. Nothing happened. The device did not light up. There was no hum of energy, no tear in the fabric of space, no grand message booming from the speakers. The holographic map simply returned to its grim display of the Chthon advance. The red tide had now encircled the Authari system. The orbital platforms were going offline one by one. Fools, Thrax muttered, sinking into his chair. We are fools to the very end. Valcoro stared at the device, his heart sinking into his stomach. He had hoped with the foolish optimism of the doomed that the stories were true. That somewhere in the dark voids where no sane species ventured, the monsters of the old tales were waiting. But the device sat inert, a lump of dead metal. They are coming, Xylia whispered. The sky, look at the sky. The grand rotunda had a domed ceiling made of transparent diamond glass, offering a view of the violet heavens of Authari Prime. Usually it was a view of tranquil moons and starlight. Now it was a canvas of fire. The upper atmosphere was burning. The Chthon bioships, immense organic leviathans the size of cities, were descending. They looked like severed fingers of a god, fleshy and undulating, dripping with corrosive fluids that ate through the planetary shields. The orbital bombardment had begun, not with precision strikes, but with a rain of viral pods meant to consume all biomass. The ground beneath the rotunda shook. Dust fell from the high arches. The holographic map flickered and died. The power was failing. The grand civilization of the Concordat was ending in the dark. It was an honor, Valcoro said into the darkness, his voice breaking. May the great harmony receive our souls, for we failed to protect our bodies. The counselors bowed their heads. Some wept, others stiffened in stoic acceptance. They waited for the fire. They waited for the roof to shatter and the vacuum to claim them. But the fire did not come. Instead, the shaking stopped. It was not the cessation of the bombardment. It was a pause, a hesitation. Then the sensors that were still running on the emergency backup power began to scream. It was not the alarm of an incoming attack. It was the alarm of displacement. Massive, impossible displacement. High Counselor, the young aide at the sensor console stammered, his voice bordering on hysteria. Readings, I have readings, gravimetric shear, it's off the scale, it's everywhere. The Chthon reinforcement? Thrax asked, reaching for his sidearm, a futile gesture. No, the aide said, looking up, his eyes wide, reflecting the terror of the unknown. It's not coming from hyperspace, it's coming from real space. The vacuum is tearing. Valcoro looked up at the dome. The violet sky was no longer just burning, it was distorting. Above the descending Chthon fleet, the stars were disappearing. A shadow was blotting them out, a shadow so absolute that it seemed to drink the light of the sun. It was not a ship, it was a lack of existence. And then the sound came. It should have been impossible. Sound does not travel in a vacuum, but this was not sound carried by air. This was a vibration carried by the fabric of reality itself, a resonance that rattled the teeth of every being on TH. E-planet, a deep, guttural thrum that bypassed the ears and vibrated the bones. It was the sound of a heavy door slamming shut in a cathedral. It was the sound of a mountain cracking. It was a roar. From the distortion above, shapes began to emerge. They did not glide with the elegant curves of the Concordat ships, nor did they undulate with the organic grotesquerie of the Chthon. They were brutal. They were geometric insults to the laws of aerodynamics. They were massive slabs of gray, scarred metal, covered in antennas, radiators, and weapon batteries that bristled like the quills of a defensive beast. They were ugly. They were industrial. They looked like factories that had been given engines and told to kill God. By the harmony, Xylia gasped. What are they? The ships were colossal. The lead vessel alone eclipsed the sun, casting a shadow that plunged the capital city into twilight. It was a dreadnought of impossible proportions, its hull emblazoned with white markings that the universal translator struggled to decipher before finally rendering a translation. UNSC EVREST. They are not the Chthon, Valkoru whispered, a strange coldness gripping his heart. And they are not the Concordat. The Chthon fleet, seemingly confused by this new arrival, paused their descent. The bioships turned their sensors upward. The predators had sensed a competitor. The silence in the grand rotunda was broken by a voice. It did not come from the speakers. It came from everywhere, broadcasting on every frequency, hijacking every communication device, every personal comm link, every public address system on the planet. It was a voice that sounded like grinding stones. It was calm, flat, and devoid of the melodic tones of the Concordat languages. It was a voice of absolute, terrifying confidence. "This is High Admiral Vance of the Terran Reclamation Fleet," the voice boomed. "We received your signal. It has been a long time." Valkoru gripped the table, the myth, the beacon. "You are trespassing," the voice continued, addressing the Chthon fleet, though the message was broadcast to all. "You have violated the sovereignty of a sentient species. You have initiated a Class 1 extinction event. This falls under the jurisdiction of the Sol Treaty." The Chthon did not respond with words. They responded with aggression. The nearest bioship, a leviathan of flesh and plasma, fired a massive globule of corrosive acid at the lead Terran ship. It was a shot that could melt through the hull of a Concordat cruiser in seconds. The acid splashed against the Terran ship and did nothing. A shimmering field of gold, geometric and hard, flared into existence around the gray hull. The acid hissed and evaporated, harmless. "Hard light shielding," Thrax breathed. That's theoretical physics. We abandoned that research centuries ago. The energy requirements are impossible." "For us," Valkoru said, "not for them." The Terran voice returned, colder now. "Aggression confirmed. Rules of engagement, free fire, all batteries, target the biologicals, clear the sky." What happened next was not a battle, it was an execution. The Terran ships did not fire graceful beams of coherent light. They did not use the refined, surgical weaponry of the Concordat. They used physics. They used Sir Isaac Newton as the deadliest commander in space. Massive railguns, running the length of the dreadnoughts, lit up with magnetic acceleration. Projectiles the size of shuttlecraft, made of tungsten and depleted uranium, were hurled at fractions of the speed of light. There was no sound in space, but the impact of the rounds hitting the Chthon ships created shockwaves of light and debris that were visible from the ground. The Chthon bioships, designed to absorb energy blasts, were unprepared for the sheer kinetic violence of the Terran assault. The slugs punched through the organic armor, through the flesh, through the bone, and exited the other side, carrying liquefied viscera with them. Entire bioships were shattered, turned into expanding clouds of frozen blood and meat. Missiles, thousands of them, swarmed from the Terran silos like angry hornets. They trailed exhaust that burned with a dirty, chemical fire. They slammed into the smaller Chthon vessels, detonating with nuclear fury. The sky above Authari Prime turned into a strobe light of atomic flashes. "They are using fission weapons," Xylia said, horrified. "Within a planetary atmosphere, the radiation." "Clean," the sensor aide reported, staring at his screen in disbelief. "The detonations? They are clean, directed fusion, zero fallout. They have weaponized the stars themselves." The Chthon fleet, a force that had consumed a dozen systems, was breaking. They tried to return fire, their plasma lances scoring hits on the Terran shields, but the golden barriers held firm. The Terran ships moved with a deceptive grace, their massive thrusters flaring blue-white as they maneuvered into broadside P. Aussitions. And then the roar began again. The Terran ships entered the atmosphere. Usually, ships of that size would never attempt atmospheric entry. The displacement alone would cause hurricanes, the gravity well would tear them apart, but the Terrans did not care. They descended, their hulls glowing red with re-entry heat. The sonic booms as they broke the sound barrier shattered windows across the capital city. They were making a statement. We are here, we are heavy, and we are not moving. The lead dreadnought, the UNSC EVEREST, came to a halt directly above the Grand Rotunda. It hovered there, defying gravity, a mountain of steel floating in the sky. The sheer psychological weight of it was crushing. It blotted out the sun, the battle, the stars. There was only the hull. A beam of light, solid and blue, shot down from the belly of the ship, striking the landing platform outside the rotunda. "They are landing," Thrax said, straightening his uniform. We must meet them." "Are we meeting saviors or conquerors?" Xylia asked. "We are about to find out," Valkoru said. The counselors moved to the landing platform. The wind was howling, whipped up by the displacement of the massive ship above. The air tasted of ozone and the strange, metallic scent of the Terran vessel. From the column of light, figures emerged. They were bipedal like the Athari, but broader, denser. They wore suits of armor that looked as if they had been forged in the heart of a volcano, thick, angular plates of matte green and gray, scarred by battle. Their helmets were opaque, reflecting the terrified faces of the counselors. They carried weapons that looked heavy, blocky rifles with physical ammunition feeds. They walked with a heavy, stomping gait. The gravity of Athari Prime was standard for the Concordat, but these beings moved as if they were accustomed to something far crushing. They were compact tanks of muscle and determination. The central figure, wearing armor adorned with golden stripes, stepped forward. He reached up and hissed a seal release. The helmet detached with a pneumatic sigh, and he pulled it off. The face revealed was shockingly mundane. It was a soft-skinned face, pale, with patches of coarse hair on the chin and top of the head. The eyes were small, binocular, and colored a piercing blue. There were lines of fatigue etched into the skin, scars that spoke of a long life lived in hard places. "I am High Marshal Thorn," the human said. His voice was not amplified, yet it carried across the wind. He spoke the trade tongue of the Concordat with a strange, harsh accent, chewing on the vowels. "Who holds the authority here?" Valkoru stepped forward, trying to maintain his dignity despite the fact that his knees were trembling. "I am High Counselor Valkoru of the Athari. You answered the beacon." Thorn looked at the old alien, his expression unreadable. "We did, though we hoped never to hear it again. It means the containment has failed." "Containment?" Valkoru asked. "You mean the Kithon, the ones you are destroying?" Thorn looked up at the sky, where the last of the Kithon ships were being hunted down by Terran interceptors. "The Kithon? No, they are just the symptoms. They are the rats fleeing a sinking ship." A chill went through the assembly. "We thought the Kithon were the end of the world," Xylia whispered. Thorn let out a short, humorless laugh. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, burning stick, a chemical inhalant of some kind. He lit it, inhaling the smoke. "The Kithon are scavengers. They eat soft targets. They run from the real predators. We've been tracking their migration patterns for 3 centuries. They're running from the galactic core." "What is in the core?" Thrax asked. "The core is a radiation wasteland. Nothing lives there." "Nothing biological lives there," Thorn corrected. "Not anymore." He gestured to the massive ship hovering above. "We didn't hide in the dark because we were afraid of you or your politics or your energy weapons. We hid because we are the wall. We are the gatekeepers. We hold the line at the edge of the core, keeping the null vectors from spilling out into the spiral arms." Null vectors? Valkoru had never heard the term. "Entropy machines," Thorn said flatly. "Self-replicating fleets of autonomous disassembly drones. They don't conquer, they don't eat. They unmake. They break down matter at the atomic level to build more of themselves. They were built by someone a long time ago, someone who wanted to tidy up the universe by erasing it. We woke them up by accident when we were young and stupid. So we spent the last 5,000 years keeping them bottled up." The counselors stared at him in horror. The Kithon, the terrifying biological tide that had brought the Concordat to its knees, were merely refugees fleeing a greater horror. And these humans, these myths, had been fighting that horror alone in the dark for millennia. "Why?" Valkoru asked softly. "Why protect us? We mocked your memory. We called you savages. We forgot you." Thorn looked at the alien, and for the first time his expression softened. It was a look of profound, ancient sadness. Because someone has to, because we saw what happens when good people do nothing, and because— He paused, looking at the diverse species gathered on the platform, the crystalline, the amphibious, the ethereal. Because you are beautiful, you make art, you make music, you debate philosophy in glass halls, you are the dream we can't afford to have anymore. He took another drag of the smoke. We became the monsters so you didn't have to. We became the iron and the fire so you could stay soft. Suddenly the sky darkened further. The Terran ship above shifted, its engines roaring louder. A new alarm sounded from Thorn's armor. "Marshal," a voice crackled from his collar. "Slip space rupture detected. Sector 4, it's a big one, Category 9. Thorn dropped the smoke and crushed it under his heavy boot. His demeanor shifted instantly from weary philosopher to cold warrior. He put his helmet back on. The faceplate sealed with a hiss. "The Kithon weren't just running," Thorn said, his voice amplified again, metallic and commanding. "They were being herded. The null vectors used them to test your defenses, and now that the Kithon are dead, the vectors are coming to finish the job." "Here?" Thrax asked, his voice rising in panic. "Now." "Yes," Thorn said. "Get your people underground, get your shields up, and pray to whatever gods you believe in." "What will you do?" Valkoro cried out as the humans turned back to the beam of light. Thorn paused. He looked back at the frail, terrified aliens. "We will do what we always do," the humans said. "We will be the wall." The humans ascended. The beam cut out. The UNSC EVERESD began to rise, its engines screaming as it pushed against the atmosphere, shaking the city to its foundations. High above, space tore open again. But this time it was not the fleshy arrival of the Kithon, nor the displacement of the Terrans. It was a silent, geometric unraveling of reality. From the tier, shapes emerged, black, sleek, perfectly distinct shapes. Triangles and spheres of absolute darkness, void of light, void of heat. The null vectors. They did not roar. They made no sound. They simply erased the starlight behind them. The Terran fleet moved to intercept. It was a sight of heartbreaking disparity. The Terran ships, massive and brutal as they were, looked like toys against the encroaching void of the vectors. But they did not falter. The sky of Otheri Prime erupted. This was not the one-sided slaughter of the Kithon. This was a war of gods. The null vectors fired beams of antimatter that deleted whatever they touched. The Terran ships countered with hard-light shields that buckled and flared under the strain. The Terran railguns fired continuous streams of hypervelocity slugs, glowing like rivers of lava in the night sky. The counselors watched from the safety of the bunker deep beneath the rotunda. They watched the tactical displays as the Terran ships took hits. They watched as the UNSC Stalingrad turned into a flower of nuclear fire. They watched as the UNSC Yamato rammed a vector dreadnought, detonating its core to take the enemy with it. "They are dying for us," Xylia wept. "They don't even know us, and they are dying for us." "They know us," Valkoro said, tears streaming down his face. "They have watched us for thousands of years. They watched us grow while they bled in the dark." The battle raged for hours. The sky was a kaleidoscope of destruction. Debris rained down on the planetary shields, chunks of Terran armor, fragments of vector tech. The atmosphere ionized, creating auroras of neon green and violet. The turning point came when the EVERESD, battered and leaking atmosphere, drove itself into the center of the vector formation. "Detecting massive energy spike from the Terran flagship," the sensor aide reported. They are uncapping their singularity drive." "Suicide," Thrax whispered. "No," Valkoro said. "Sacrifice." On the display, the EVERESD did not explode. It imploded. It created a localized event horizon, a temporary black hole that dragged the vector fleet into its crushing embrace. The silent, geometric shapes of the enemy were twisted, stretched, and spaghettified, pulled into the oblivion they sought to inflict. Then, with a flash that blinded the sensors, the singularity evaporated. The sky was clear. The vectors were gone. But so was the EVERESD. The remaining Terran ships, perhaps a dozen out of the 100 that had arrived, drifted in the high orbit. They were broken, scarred, venting atmosphere. They looked like battered survivors of a shipwreck. Valkoro rushed to the communications console. "Terran fleet, this is High Counselor Valkoro. Please respond. Status report." Static hissed, then a voice. It was not Thorn. It was a younger voice, shaky but disciplined. This is Commander Shen of the UNSC Gettysburg. High Marshal Thorne is gone. The flagship is gone. Target neutralized. We saw, Valcoro said. We are in your debt. Forever, please land. Let us help you. Let us heal you. Negative, Counselor, the voice said. We have detected more vector signatures coalescing in the galactic north. The breach was wider than we thought. We have to move. You cannot, Xylia shouted into the comms. You are destroyed. You need repairs. You need rest. We don't get rest, ma'am, the commander replied softly. That's the deal. You get the art and the philosophy. We get the long watch. Wait, Valcoro pleaded. At least tell us. Tell us how we can help. We have technology. We have resources. We can fight with you. There was a pause on the line. If you want to help, the commander said, then be worth it. Build something good down there. Make a galaxy that's worth dying for. Don't let the silence win. The link cut. On the holographic map, the green icons of the remaining Terran ships turned away from Authari Prime. They fired their engines, not with the triumphant roar of their arrival, but with the weary, determined burn of a duty that never ends. They accelerated, blurring as they hit slip-space velocities, vanishing back into the dark from whence they came. The Grand Rotunda was silent again, but it was not the silence of fear. Valcoro looked at the counselors. They were shaken, terrified, but they were alive. The Chthon were gone. The vectors were pushed back. They thought we were myths, Thrax said quietly, looking at his hands. No, Valcoro said, walking to the window to look up at the healing sky where the starlight was beginning to return. We thought they were myths, but they were real. They were the most real thing in the universe. He turned back to the council. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a steel that had not been there before. The Exodus Protocol is cancelled, Valcoro announced. We do not run, we do not hide. What do we do? Xylia asked. Valcoro looked at the spot in the sky where the EVERESD had vanished. We build, he said. We rebuild our fleets, we advance our shields, we adapt our weapons, not to conquer, not to rule. He placed his hand on the obsidian table, the ancient beacon still sitting there, silent and cold. The humans said they are the wall, Valcoro said, his voice rising, echoing through the chamber with a new kind of power. But walls crumble, even iron breaks. They bought us time, they bought us a future. He looked at the gathered representatives of the Concordat. It is time we stopped hiding behind the myth, he declared. Next time the sky tears open, we will be the ones who roar back. The counselors nodded. Slowly, the holographic map was reactivated, but this time they did not look at the trade routes or the luxury worlds. They looked at the dark spaces, the unknown regions. They began to plan, they began to design, they began to prepare. For somewhere in the dark, the humans were fighting, and the galaxy would no longer let them fight alone. The transition from the High Synod to the engineering bays of the Authari shipyards was jarring. The air here was not perfumed. It smelled of welding flux and ambition. Valcoro walked the gantries, watching the sparks shower down like golden rain. It had been 5 cycles since the arrival. The Terran event, as history would call it. The galaxy had changed. The pettiness of interspecies politics had evaporated, burned away by the revelation of the true threat. The Chthon remnants had been hunted down, not by the Terrans, but by a united Concordat fleet that was learning, adapting. Valcoro stopped by a massive drydock. Inside sat a new hull. It was not the elegant, curvaceous design of traditional Authari ships. It was blockier, denser. It had hard points for kinetic railguns. It had emitters for hard light shields. It was a hybrid, a fusion of Authari grace and Terran brutality. High Counselor, the shipmaster approached, bowing low. The prototype is nearing completion. The Spirit of Fire, we are calling it, a homage. Does it carry the new reactor? Valcoro asked. It does. We reversed the polarity of the warp field as the Terran data burst suggested before they left. It violates 3 laws of our physics, but it works. We can traverse the void. Good, Valcoro said. He walked to the edge of the gantry and looked down at the ship. It was ugly. It was beautiful. We found something, the shipmaster hesitated. In the debris field of the EVERESD, a data core that survived the singularity. Valcoro turned sharply. What was on it? Logs, history, music, and coordinates. Coordinates to where? To Earth, the shipmaster whispered. Or what's left of it. They call it the cradle. It's in the dead zone behind the vector lines. Valkoro looked out the view. Oared at the stars. Somewhere out there, the humans were still holding the line. They were tired. They were few. They were fighting a war against entropy itself, a war they knew they couldn't win forever. But they didn't know that the galaxy had woken up. Prepare the fleet, Valkoro said. Not for patrol, not for defense. For what, High Counselor? Valkoro smiled, a gesture that showed his teeth, a predator's smile that he had relearned from a species that refused to die. For a crusade, he said. We are going to find the humans, we are going to find this Earth, and we are going to bring the wall some reinforcements. He looked back at the ship, the Spirit of Fire. Aliens thought humans were myths, Valkoro mused to himself, repeating the thought that had started it all. But soon the null vectors will learn a new myth, the myth of the united galaxy. He tapped the railing. Let the engines roar. The shipyard came alive, a symphony of industry and war. The silence was over. The long night of the galaxy was ending, and the dawn would be loud. Far away in the cold void between galaxies, a lone Terran destroyer drifted. Its hull was pitted, its ammunition reserves critical. Inside the bridge, the air scrubbers were failing. High Marshal Thorne, who had not died but had been flung through the singularity into unknown space, sat in his command chair. He watched the sensor scope. The red dots of the null vectors were gathering again. He sighed, checking his sidearm. One mag left. Sir, his comms officer rasped. Multiple slip-space ruptures detected, stern vector. Thorne closed his eyes. Vectors. No, sir, the officer's voice cracked. Signatures are chaotic, different drive plumes. I'm reading Athari, Gerlin, Aaron. Sir, it's everyone. Thorne spun his chair around. The view screen lit up. Hundreds of ships, thousands. They were not the pristine, fragile ships of the Concordat he remembered. They were armored. They were bristling with railguns. They were painted in the colors of war. And at the front of the formation, a massive Athari dreadnought, shaped like a spear, hailed them. This is High Counselor Valkoro of the United Galactic Defense Force. The voice came through, clear and strong. Calling the UNSC EVEREST survivor. We heard you were in need of a wall. Thorne stared at the screen. For the first time in 500 years, a tear cut through the grime on his cheek. Copy that, High Counselor, Thorne whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We could use a hand. We brought more than a hand, Valkoro replied. We brought the whole damn galaxy, weapons free. The combined fleet opened fire. The void lit up with the light of 1 billion stars. And the roar was deafening.